Hello, and welcome to this video on why the very old and the very young have a great deal in common. This scene from House summarizes the situation.
Cases, same symptoms. What do 6-year-olds and 70-year-olds have in common?
Their immune systems don't work as well. Could be listeria.
Already checked for that. Leukemia has a higher prevalence in both young and old.
So does asthma.
No.
Both get diabetes.
No. The nearly dead and the newly bred have more in common with each other than with people in the middle. It's weird. It's kind of a circle of life thing.
It does not give the necessary background to understand why. To begin, a simple primer on how immunity systems work. The very young and very old have a number of points of similarity in how their immune system both works and responds to external threats. The immune system uses two arms. The first is the innate system that lacks specificity. It responds to parts of the pathogenic cell that are conserved or similar across most of the malignant organisms. These include sugars, proteins, and surface markers. The other things it looks for are humoral. These are effectively antibodies that flag the pathogen and make it more obvious for the immune system. This system also includes physical barriers like the skin and saliva. The range of cells that provide innate protection include neutrophils, macrophages, basophils, and eosinophils. The innate system uses another immune cell known as a natural killer cell. This targets self cells that are behaving abnormally, such as cancer. The other arm is the major difference between the very young and the very old. This is the adaptive immune system, which is also known as the specific immune system. This arm can be trained to deal with a specific kind of pathogen in a superior manner to the innate system. This includes a range of B cells and T cells. B cells provide memory for the immune system and produce copious amounts of antibodies. T cells take the action against viruses and virus-infected cells. The B cells feed back into the innate and adaptive immune systems by bridging these two. These are a range of cells which begin as a bank of possible candidates. Some are very specific, requiring certain circumstances to activate. Some of the others are broader in their possible targets. B cell immunity is dependent on the available candidates to do the work. These then activate T cells specific to the foreign pathogen by providing specific targets. There are intricacies beyond this, but for the comparison of the aged and young, the difference is in the adaptive B cells, and how the innate system can cope with and without this support. It has been established that both the very young and the very old have a different population. The very young begin with a small array of immune cells. These are essentially stem cells which can transform into a range of immune cells, some of those being B cells. These undergo a rapid expansion during early childhood. This creates a large pool of new and novel immune cells. These can respond to a wide range of pathogens and other things again. This also creates another problem. These immune cells react to a wide range of targets. This includes self-identified protein, sugars, and lipids. This is called autoimmunity. This is gradually reduced through a selection and retention of active immune cells. This selection is retained through the adulthood with adaptations from the existing selection. Eventually, old age is reached. Old age rewinds the process of immune system expansion. This is a consequence of several factors. The first is mutations. The majority are not advantageous, and this leads to that cell line and selection being taken out of the pool. Another is the inability to create new candidate cell lines for immunity. The aged person has fewer stem cells overall, and fewer that can differentiate in the immune cell precursors necessary for expansion. And last, but not the only, is a diminished capacity to adapt the existing immune cell selection. The cells that can be altered genetically to create a response are diminished. It takes longer to produce cells able to respond to threats. This is why the elderly need flu shots. Without this, they would likely take far longer to respond, thereby suffer considerably more and possibly die. The next difference is far simpler: genetics. The reason elderly people get more cancer than those younger is that their DNA is less stable, but this is only true as far as stable tissues go. Mutations are more common in both the young and old in systems that require constant access to genetic structures. Mutations are more common and telomeres are shorter in the elderly, and the latter of these are the structures that give stability to the DNA structure overall. After about 50 divisions, they generally trigger cell death. However, in the very young, the cells divide very quickly, which leads to a high rate of apoptosis. However, there is a distinction between the elderly and the young in the manner in which this happens. In the young, the rate of mutation increases as a consequence of the rapid expansion and constant access to the genetic material. On an individual cell level, this is not a big problem. The immune system sweeps up error-prone cells in the young. In the elderly, these cells as a population have dwindled, and therefore surveillance is worse, and eventually cancer can slip by. And in the very young, since there are so many cells undergoing such a rapid expansion, the probability of at least one getting by without being detected is far higher. Cells can only function within a very controlled environment, and in the liver this is particularly so, given they deal with so much toxic material. They need the right temperature, pH, and chemical environment to survive. Over time, the body has developed systems for maintaining such an environment, and these mechanisms can begin to fail or are not yet established in both the very young and the very old. The young children have yet to develop these systems to the full extent in adulthood, and this leaves their major organs vulnerable. This is why children are not advised to be given things like paracetamol or ibuprofen, as these can both damage the liver considerably because they have yet to develop the capacity. This comes in the form of free radicals quite often, or in the form of toxic compounds as metabolites. A lot of these are free radical containing molecules, often oxygen molecules that are missing an electron. These are very destructive because they take electrons from other molecules and destabilize them. This damages vital tissues, proteins, membranes, and often DNA. Within the more general body, apoptosis is needed in the very young and very old. This is both a boon and a disadvantage. The very young need the fast growth of muscle and tissue, and more to be controlled carefully. Without this, the tissue can grow without restraints. An example is bone tumors and leukemias. These are both very common in the very old and very young. Organs and tissues vary as to how quickly dead cells within them are replaced. In skin and bowel tissue, for example, cell turnover is fairly fast. The old need this apoptosis to control the destruction of fragile tissues. As organs and tissues are more liable to break down, damaged parts need to be removed and replaced. Not doing so increases the toxicity that aggregates from damaged cells. In others, like muscles and brain, they last a far longer time, but when they die, they aren't replaced at all. The very old have lost many of these irreplaceable cells, whilst the very young have not yet had the population explosion of these cells, and therefore they are not present. Gastric cancer in young patients is more aggressive, and histological characterizations compare it to elderly patients. The survival rates between the two groups do not differ to a great degree, and this owes partly to the immune system and partly to the rate at which it grows and the degree to which it can have an effect. A final category are the hormones. As individuals age, the glands that produce hormones don't function as well. Hormones are chemically specialized, and they function in the body in a very particular way. Sex hormones, as an example, are responsible for sexual characteristics, muscle and bone health. Other hormones like growth hormone and thyroid hormone are also responsible for keeping regular functions going. This can include immune responses. The elderly have this at one extreme level. They cannot respond and adjust to environmental effects using hormones. An example of this is menopause. Menopause occurs as a direct result of a shortage of hormones, particularly the female steroids. The very young have the extreme opposite but similar problem. They have an excessive amount of these hormones compared to an adult. This is a result of the need to initiate the explosion of cells, growth, and change. The problem with this is that it makes them hyperreactive to the environment around them. Consider that the average height of a child over the last 70-odd years has increased significantly over that from any time beforehand. This is because the environment has become enriched. Food is more freely available, there are fewer threats, so on and so forth. This has led to a greater ability to respond to this rich environment by the hormones, leading to greater growth and survivability. Therefore, children are bigger and living longer, and living entirely. Next is the environment. In simple terms, children and the elderly are very fragile. They do not respond as well to heat and cold. As a consequence, simple physical wear and tear takes a greater toll on both the very young and the very old. they take far longer to recover and heal, and as a result, any damage that occurs to them will be longer lasting. Finally, there are toxins. The use of ibuprofen and paracetamol has been stated so far, but there are other compounds which will have just as much effect, in the very old and the very young. This is often due to the liver. The liver is still small in the very young, or in the very old, very fragile. As a result, things like alcohol will have a larger effect on a small child or an older person because the body does not have the means of removing it very well. Or, if it has the means, it has lost a substantial amount of that over time. Similarly, the kidneys are worn out in the elderly, and in the very young, they are not well developed yet. As a result of this lack of coping mechanisms for toxins, this means that damage will occur far more easily because the toxic substances accrue and remain and have an effect for much, much longer. There are more varied mechanisms that are similar between the elderly and the young. However, the ones covered so far give the general gist of what the similarities between the very young and the very old are, stating the major tissues and other systems by which the very young and the very old are similar gives a general understanding of just why the very old and very young are more vulnerable than those in between, as the very old and the very young do not have the coping mechanisms that are at that fulcrum of very good but wearing out, hyperreactive or not reactive enough, and more again. Thank you for watching this video. Please post any comments, questions or suggestions you may have below.